Hello, good afternoon from Manila, the Philippines. Good evening, good morning. A very warm welcome to everybody to this spotlight session on green ports and shipping. My name is Karma Yangzom. I am the Principal Environment Specialist in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of ADB. And amongst other things, I work on air quality management and green infrastructure including ports, of course. So in today's session, we will have two speakers. The first speaker will talk about the long-term decarbonization strategy of the maritime and shipping sector. And our second speaker will talk about some specific ADB finance port project in the Pacific Islands. So before I invite our first speaker, I would like to just state a few numbers, a few facts out there, which actually I find really interesting, and I wasn't aware of this until I started preparing actually for this session. So, and this is just to highlight the importance of maritime shipping. 70% of global trade by volume is carried out by maritime shipping. So that's really a huge volume. And if you go by the value, by the dollar value, it's 80%. And 60% of the goods that are shipped are loaded or unloaded in developing country ports. So this is another important point, obviously, because we are working in the developing country world. Maritime transport accounts for 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So this is another huge proportion. And the emissions are still rising very rapidly. At the same time, as we all know, ports, particularly seaports, are highly vulnerable and exposed to climate change impacts. Obviously, sea level rise is a big one, and also increasing storm surges. So these are just a few numbers and facts out there for us to, understand the background of this session. And I would now like to invite our first speaker. Our first speaker is Charles Haskell. He is the program manager for Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonization Hub, which is a joint initiative between the Lloyd's Register Foundation and Group. The mission of this hub is to accelerate the safe and sustainable decarbonization of the maritime industry. So Lloyd has been working with this company for more than 20 years, and he has a wide range of experience, including practical hands-on experience working as a project manager for ship construction in Korea, in South Korea, and as a surveyor and auditor in the Middle East, and he is now based in the UK as a business development manager. So Charles, I invite you to please give your presentation.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Karma. Good day, everyone, and thank you for the time this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are. I've had the introduction, so I can skip straight into the main presentation, which is fantastic. But just to give a quick overview of the mission of the Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonisation Hub, and this is for the safe and sustainable decarbonisation of the maritime sector. And this is really to deliver safe, technically feasible and commercially viable zero-emission shipping by 2050, but really vessels on the water by 2030 to kickstart the process. As Karma mentioned, currently shipping is transporting 80% of the world's goods and is emitting about 3% of greenhouse gas, of CO2. And this is equivalent to a country of about Germany, and is also relatively similar to the aviation sector. Now, currently, within the IMO, which is the overall governing body for shipping, the current targets are for a 50% reduction by 2050 by absolute terms. So this isn't a 50% in terms of one ship, because shipping will grow further. So in overall absolute terms, it's about 75%. However, this isn't in alignment with the Paris Agreement. In alignment to meet the Paris Agreement, this would require a 100% reduction by 2050. Now, whilst 3% may not seem a lot for a transportation sector, which is transporting 80% of the world's goods, if left unchecked, this will rise to about 10%, potentially 20% by 2050 of the world's CO2 emissions. Now, currently, as I said, shipping is governed by the IMO, but there are other state actors and regional actors also involved in policy, such as the EU. But there's also growing consumer pressure. And there's an update when we were at COP26, and particularly last year, we saw more and more end users, such as Amazon, Unilever, IKEA, Brooks, coming into the mix, and they signed an agreement called the COSEV agreement. And what really happened last year is the dial shifted from talking about 50% by 2050 to moving to zero by 2050. And this is very positive. So when we look back at 2018, the industry was in a bit of a, I'd say, a shock of how we're going to achieve 50% by 2050. And over the last year, this dial has changed very rapidly into a greater push to zero by 2050. And then with the COSEV agreement, with those on the left-hand side of the screen, that has now changed to actually moving the dial to the left, talking about zero by 2040. And they're committed to only shipping their goods on zero-emission shipping by that date. You also had the first movers. You had Trafigura, Volvo, Fortescue, Yara, Apple, etc., also aligning to zero by 2050, and if not sooner. And you had a number of countries as well signing up for zero by 2050. Now, unfortunately, at the last IMO MEPC meeting, which came about 2 weeks after COP, this didn't shift the dial there, but this will be continued. So the ambition is growing, and really now we're talking about zero emissions by 2050 within the maritime industry. But when we look at this, we're going to have to go through an energy transition from using today's fuels. And it's not going to happen overnight. And this is why we're talking about 2050 or 2040, because it can't happen now. But what we need is a critical window for change. And then it's going to be a rapid scaling up of zero carbon fuels. And then we'll be switching, sort of having mass adaptation and switching the fuels. And this has got to be managed quite carefully, but also we need to work backwards from 2050 to put in those milestones to make sure they're checked. And one of these is really getting vessels and getting green corridors open by 2025. And by 2030 is to have 5% of the fuels used within the maritime industry being zero carbon. Now, these could be blended fuels on ships or could be a pure zero carbon ship. But the aim is to get the 5% by 2030 in order to ensure that this transition curve is on the right track. The green corridors by 2025, which was signed by the Clydebank, which is part of the Clydebank Declaration at COP26, is of equal importance. And that's really getting the early movers started, and also so that we can take learnings from these projects to start scaling up. So what are the big challenges here for the energy transition? If we look back at the previous energy transition from coal to oil within shipping, we moved to a fuel which was cheaper, more abundant, easier to store, more energy dense, and safer. Now, when we look at the options for this energy transition of moving from fuel oil or LNG to a hydrogen-based fuel, whether that's pure hydrogen or ammonia or methanol or even nuclear, is none of these options are as safe as today's fuel. They're not as accessible. They're not as they're not as energy dense. So this poses a whole new load of questions, and this is where a whole myriad of different elements are going to have to come into play in order that we can transition to these fuels. To put it into context as well, we're not just talking about the ship itself. When we looked at the previous energy transition as well, going from oil, the oil was available, as I was saying, and that came into the bunkering and the ports integration. and was being traded as a commodity as well. So we had oil being traded in coal burning ships to begin with before they moved over to oil. So we've got to look across the whole energy sector in order to resolve the challenges. And this is starting with the resources. So where are we getting the resources from? And really the true zero carbon fuels, they're going to have to come from renewable energy sources, whether this is by wind, tidal, wave, and biosources as well. But we then need that production and conversion. So when we look at the production and conversion, where are the technologies today to enable this? Because this isn't just about the technology as well, it's about the cost, and I'll touch on that in a moment as well. So we're going to look at the conversion and then the bunkering and ports integration. So how the port's going to be able to store this fuel. It's not going to be a case of swapping out existing fuel tanks for new fuel tanks. The fuel is going to be less energy dense, so we're going to need larger fuel tanks, and the material compatibility of some of these fuels will not be so acceptable to current materials in the tanks, so we'll potentially need new tanks and new infrastructure. And as I said, and I touched on safety as well, when we're looking at particularly, say, hydrogen and ammonia being used as a fuel in shipping, these have very different characteristics from fuel oil in terms of being explosive, but also when we're referring to ammonia as being highly toxic as well. So we've got to consider this and the safety of the port integration, and then we move on board the ship. But what's important when looking at this, this table here, which I've got shown, is if you take out the two sectors on the right, the fuel storage, handling on board, and the propulsion, and that's really your ship, you could stick anything else into that bucket. You could stick aviation in there, you could stick factories and power plants. So this is really applying to most sectors as well. And this is where the energy transition gets interesting in terms of shipping, not just looking at its own needs, but actually broadening out and talking to other stakeholders on the land. So how are we trying to address this, and how do we need to address this? Is I talked before about, we've got the safety side and we've got the technology, but really we need to look at the instigators to make the energy transition happen. This isn't just about being technology ready, about having the electrolyzers to create the fuel and the ships being able to burn the fuel. And in fact, most of that challenges are already done. We know we can have ammonia burning vessels on the water by 2024, 2025. And the technology is available there today to create the green ammonia. However, the investment case for using that fuel today is not there. One thing from the analysis which has been done and verified, and this is by several different stakeholders as well, is the fuel of the future, to use that phrase, is going to be 2 to 4 times more expensive than the fuel today. So suddenly we need a commercial incentive to adopt these fuels. That commercial incentive will come from policy and what we're talking about, community readiness. So there's a number of things. We've got technology readiness, community readiness, and investment readiness. And those three all tie into each other, because if the technology is readily available and is being produced that actually the cost is lowered, then we'll get the acceptance of the fuel within the scene. If the policy comes out, which is actually making the ammonia or the hydrogen more cost competitive, then it is seen as being a likely uptake as well. So the three play nicely into each other and can lever on each other. And when we look at this, it's important to look at it across the whole supply chain, as I was showing on the previous slide, that we've got to take that into consideration. So moving on from this, and the way that we're looking at this is the way we're directing our resources and efforts is we're looking at how can we accelerate the readiness levels of each of these. And we have a number of different projects. As I talked about for the technology readiness, and there we include safety as well. Ammonia has quite a few issues there of being used in terms of toxicity. So we're undertaking a large piece of work with the Mercer McKinney Miller Centre for Zero Carbon Shipping on an ammonia quantitative risk assessment, really trying to delve down and get the understandings, because the last thing we need in the energy transition is for a major accident to occur at an early stage, because this will hit confidence, not just only in the seafarers, but also in investment confidence as well. So we need to keep that moving. And we have a number of other projects. But really what's interesting when we've built out this model of looking across the different readiness levels for the different fuels across the whole supply chain is in across all of the different supply chain areas, the investment readiness is currently low. So why would a ship owner adopt a zero carbon fuel, or what does he need to take forward to his investment community, or actually even to the policy community to say, this is what we need over the whole part. So we therefore did a study looking at the investment readiness across the whole board. And we based this on feeder container ships between Singapore and Hong Kong. There are a number of reasons we took this container ship study. And one of them really was that we deemed it as scalable. The feeder container ships in size can be scaled up to larger vessels, but also it is a hub area being Singapore. So this transition could cascade to another transition, or it could feed off another fleet transitioning as well. And we looked at 3 different fuels. We looked at transition from heavy fuel oil to methanol, ammonia, and hydrogen. And from this case study, we then built up a framework. But what was key to this study, it isn't just looking at the ships themselves, it was looking at the fuel supply. So where is the fuel going to come from? And we looked at 56 different fuel suppliers for migrating from a lower carbon to a zero carbon fuel. We looked at, and this ranged from everywhere from Australia, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia and Qatar as well, of where will the fuel come in? Because the cheaper the fuel can be, the earlier the energy transition will happen. But we're in context, this fleet here, we looked at 222 vessels, which currently use 1.4 million tons of fuel oil and emit 4.7 million tons of CO2. So these small steps can make a large difference as well. So out of this study, we have several sort of offsprings from this study, but really the key part of this study looked at how the fleet growth is intrinsically linked to the fuel supply growth. One can't work without the other. And it's all about collaboration between fuel suppliers and the shipping fleets as well, in order to make sure that the scalability of the fuel mix will also match with the vessels being ready, and therefore ensuring that we can have offtake agreements with the fuel suppliers, and that this can link into the ship owner having confidence to order the ships which will burn the fuels. And one of the next parts of this study will also to be ensure that the ports can also scale up to this challenge. So moving up towards 2050, particularly between the 2030s and 2040s, where we need larger scale up, that the port infrastructure is able to keep up with this growth as well. So this is really a key collaboration. And when we look at this area, it's got to be a collaboration between the ports, the fuel suppliers, and the shipping industry to ensure a successful energy transition, not just for the ships themselves, but also the countries they serve. So the report is downloadable, and there's a link at the bottom, and we're quite happy to take any questions at a later date as well, once you've digested that report. So that is just a brief overview, hopefully to set the scene of where the decarbonisation of the shipping industry fits in to the whole supply chain and how it can assist. And with that, I believe I can take some questions now and also at the end, which I'm looking forward to.
Thank you, Charles. Oh, that's really exciting to hear about all these new fuels. And so you've already done these studies and the technology is out there. It's more a matter of making everybody investment ready. So it's very encouraging that it looks like that it is possible to have that target of zero carbon fuels. I mean, initially at the beginning, when you mentioned that, I was thinking this sounds a bit too ambitious, but after hearing the latter part of your presentation, it sounds like it could be feasible. So thank you, great presentation. And we got a very good question. So perhaps we can take this one question before we move on to Juan's presentation. So this is a question from Adrian Simmons on asking for your opinion on hybrid and lower emission fuels, including diesel, electric, FAME fuels, and LPG as a journey towards the transition of total decarbonization of maritime transport. So Charles, over to you.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And I think if I was to go back to the slide where I showed the energy transition and the rate of change, and we've got the here and now today, the fuels to transition onto ammonia or hydrogen or methanol isn't viable today, tomorrow, in many cases. But what can be done today is energy efficiency. So currently fuel is very cheap in the marine sector. And there's a lot of energy efficiency technologies which just aren't utilized. And this comes from technologies on board the ship, such as hybrid technologies, utilizing batteries for load sharing, etc., but also utilizing air lubrication systems, wind systems, and other technologies, but also operational efficiency. So that's part of the shipping sector. So there's already huge efficiency gains which can be made there. Now, as there's other regulations coming to shipping, we've got Carbon Intensity Index and EEXI, but all of those things will hopefully drive that energy efficiency, because as we talked about, those energy efficiencies aren't being adopted today because fuel is cheap. The cost of installing this or adopting the technology, it doesn't have a quick return on investment for the ship owner. But as we talk about the future and the fuels being 2 to 4 times more expensive than the fuels of today, suddenly that return on investment becomes very sudden and very quick. So it's worth investing. But it's imperative that actually they're invested today, not just to lower today's greenhouse gas emissions, but actually to mature the technology. So when we're involved in that much higher fuel cost over the next few years and decades, is actually we're using our fuel more sensibly today. So that's part of the shipping part. But just to expand that a little bit as well, when we talk about operational efficiency, there's also huge operational efficiencies which can be done by the ports in terms of accepting the vessels and having a time of arrival and everything. And that needs to be more intrinsically linked as well, so that ships arrive on time and therefore can prepare their passage planning to be the most optimal for fuel consumption, so that can be reduced. So there's a lot of quick wins today before we move on to the fuels. But also when we talk about the fuels, we need to think about a transition pathway. We need to have our goal on the 2050 and how we're going to get there, and how we're going to get to that zero carbon fuel. Because there could be an element with certain fuels where we may adopt a fuel, but it won't get us all the way to zero. But it may produce quick wins today. So there's no single answer for fuel choice. It's all about the transition pathway of how you're going to get there in the end. So it's a good question, and a lot of answers in there. But there's quick wins today, but it's important then also to focus on that long-term vision.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Charles. So yeah, efficiency is key, and actually there is still a lot of options for improving the efficiency without changing the fuel yet. And we need to have a good transition mechanism in order to change to these new fuels. So we do have a follow-up question, but perhaps we can go back to Adrian's question later. I'm sure there'll be other questions as well. So for now, I think we should move on to our next speaker, Juan. And in the meantime, I invite our audience to please go ahead and post your questions in the chat box, and we will pick it up during the Q&A session after our second presentation. So Juan Francisco Gonzalez Jimenez, he is a transport specialist in ADB, working in the Pacific Department. He is the project officer for several ADB transport projects in Tonga and Tuvalu. And he's working on projects such as the Nuku Alofa Port Upgrade Project and the Outer Island Maritime Infrastructure Project. And I think we will hear about these projects in Juan's presentation. And these projects are working on improving transport connectivity and accessibility, both internationally as well as domestically. He's also working on a couple of technical assistance projects, which are focused on strengthening domestic connectivity as well as climate resilience in the Pacific countries. So with that, I hand over the floor to you, Juan.
Thanks a lot, Karma. Thanks a lot, Charles, for your excellent presentation. So, well, as Karma said, I'm a transport specialist in the Transport and Communications divisions of ADB. So our work in the Pacific region is quite different to the rest of the work of ADB in Asia, in the Asian developing countries. Well, as you can see in this map, the Pacific region is a huge region formed by very small or sometimes a bit larger islands, and they have very unique challenges, mainly due to the remoteness of these countries. So we do many different kinds of transport projects, from roads, bridges, airports, but also in the maritime sector, especially in the side of the port, and a little bit less in the side of the shipping. And we do from grants, which is like a direct assistance that they don't need to return, to loans, to finance some certain projects. And then we can start sometimes at the master plan level, and then we continue to pre-feasibility, feasibility studies, detailed design, all the way through construction and handover of the infrastructure to the recipient, to the country. So the region is quite diverse. Some islands are quite big, like Papua New Guinea. Some islands are quite small. Some countries are formed by different islands so there are many challenges in this region, and of course not only the challenge that they have in terms of connectivity, but also the implementation of these projects is also difficult, because as you can imagine, there is a huge risk of undertaking any big infrastructure in these remote places. So I'm just gonna run through some of the projects that ADB is working in the Pacific. One of this one is the improvement of the Apia port in Samoa, and this one is very interesting as well because it has the development of a green port policy for the Samoa Ports Authority. This one is in Nauru, which is the construction of the only port of Nauru. Before they didn't have like a port of the size sufficient for the kind of vessels calling at the port. This one is in Honiara, in Solomon Islands. I'm aware that some of the audience may not have heard of these countries, but they are small countries. In some cases, they have a population of 10,000 people. In some cases, 100,000, 1 million. So they are quite small, but ports and maritime infrastructure is actually the lifeline for this country. This is the port of Honiara, the main international port of the Solomon Islands. So we're also working in upgrading the infrastructure in this port. But also we have projects like this one in Tuvalu, which is mainly about improving the domestic accessibility. Tuvalu has some other islands. It has a total of 8 islands, and some of the islands, they didn't have any kind of harbor facilities, So in some cases we are starting with building the very basic infrastructure, in these countries. This is another interesting project, which is the Nuku Alofa Port Upgrade Project in Tonga. Here we're actually introducing some green and smart components in the project, mainly to improve the lighting, the pavement, introducing some fuel monitoring system, green port policy as well. But as you can see, maritime decarbonization and developing of green ports, smart ports is always in the agenda of ADB. And every time we have an opportunity in each of these projects, not only in the maritime sector, but also in the road sector or in the air transport sector, we try to introduce some elements in these projects. The only thing is that in some cases we are facing a huge challenge in the region, no? Which is that the infrastructure is deteriorated. It's in some cases it's a very old infrastructure that has to be repaired, and sometimes we're even facing like urgent needs. Like something happens, and then we need to provide assistance to rehabilitate and to bring the infrastructure to the original standard of the infrastructure. No? So, for example, in this one, this is the port of Tonga. This is the same photo as before, but this is after the volcano that hit Tonga a couple of weeks ago. So we were working in this project. We are trying to introduce innovation and green port policies and components in the project. But then infrastructure also needs to be resilient to climate change and to natural disasters. And we are in a region that is very vulnerable to cyclones, to strong winds and surge and earthquakes in some cases, and tsunamis and volcanoes. So the challenge is always to find the balance between the different priorities, because Charles said something very interesting in his presentation, no? That sustainability in maritime transport means or entails safety, social inclusive, accessibility, reliability. So all of these elements need to be there, no? And then when we coupled these elements with the different priorities, for example, in this case, it's very clear that the priority is to rebuild and to rehabilitate and to make the infrastructure more reliable, because when this happens again, because it will happen, if it is not a volcano, it's a tsunami, it's an earthquake or a cyclone that happens every year. No? So when this happens again, the infrastructure has to be resilient, no? to be able to get back to the original state. So it looks like we have different priorities, no? Like resilience, like disaster resilience to climate change, decarbonization, and sometimes it looks like some of these priorities are conflicting, no? Mainly because the funding, we cannot do everything we would like to do. There is something very special also about this region. Doing anything is very expensive, no? Because many things are not available in the countries and has to be imported. And the transaction cost is quite high, no? So it looks like we are in a crossroad that we need to choose which way we take, no? But it shouldn't be like that, no? And it is not like that. Our work is actually not to choose one or the other, but to find the way to complement the different priorities and to find a solution in which we can, of course, rehabilitate and bring everything to a functional state, but at the same time, start introducing innovations and starting, because at the end they are more sustainable, and that's the way the world is moving in that direction. No? And at the end, the technology is available for everybody, and the innovation is available for everybody, and we could see that, no? Like a couple of years ago with this crisis, and at the end, the technology the innovation gets to every corner of the world, and nobody should be left behind. No, when there is a new technology, a new ship that uses this, or a new infrastructure that uses that. No, but at the end of the day, something that is very important in this region is reliability. No, doing anything in the region is very complicated, as I said, no, because of the remoteness. But then when that thing is already delivered and it's already working, we need to make sure that it can be operated and maintained in a proper way. No? So how this component, how this infrastructure is implemented, and then it is reliable and it is functioning and it is sustainable in the long term, it's a very important thing that we always need to take into account when we do any intervention in this region. Because at the end, everybody, when we work with the governments and when we work with the different stakeholders, they all are very willing to receive things, no? To receive the latest technology, to receive the the latest upgrades in the infrastructure, no? But we need to worry later about how this asset is going to be looked after, no? How it's going to make it to the end of the service life, no? Because that's the other challenge that we are facing, no? The capacity to operate and the capacity to maintain this, no? Here we are always introducing in our projects, in all the projects in Samoa, in Tonga, in anywhere in the region, we're always introducing elements to improve the capacity. And now we were hearing from Charles, that there are some fuels like ammonia, like a hydrogen, but there are some at the moment, there are some issues, with the toxicity, with the handling of these fuels, no? So also on the infrastructure side, no? So how do we do in this photo that we have here, no? That we have a port that is very vulnerable in the middle of the path of the cyclones and the storm surges and everything. How do we improve this port to make it resilient? For here on the left corner, you can see what we are planning to do, no? Which is rebuilding the rock revetment, raising the level of the container yard, raising the level of the rock revetment. We need to do that, but at the same time, we need to make sure that this asset will be properly maintained, and then we can introduce the innovations there. So in summary, the technology will arrive sooner or later, because that's the way things are going. But how to do that transition while responding to the existing needs, I think it's a big challenge, but that's our work. And that's all. I think that was my last slide, Karma. So I'm very happy to answer any questions or continue discussions with you.
Thank you, Juan. It's a very interesting presentation. Yes, indeed, there are all these competing priorities, particularly in the Pacific Islands, where you have the decarbonization versus the climate change impacts and the disaster risks, as we know about the recent event in Tonga. So yes, there are a lot of competing priorities, but it's encouraging to know that the governments are actually very willing to receive new technology and to integrate new technology in their infrastructure. However, as you mentioned, the capacity for the long-term maintenance, I think that's also key. And since I've been working in the transport sector for many years, and I don't know this for railways and roads, where the initial building, which is challenging, is actually less challenging than the long-term maintenance. That's the part where very little attention goes to. So I think with that, we can move on to the Q&A session. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation to our two speakers. And if I can jump back to Charles again, since we have a couple of questions from Adrian again. And just to continue the conversation from earlier about the fuel, and his question is more about the fuel storage of non-fossil fuels, such as hydrogen and ammonia, in developing countries such as the small island states. So yeah, what are the challenges on fuel storage?
No, it's a good question, and I think first of all, it's not just about small island states as well. It's storage of those fuels anywhere. If we look at certain regulations, and I'm reflecting back to my home area of UK, but if you're storing more than 5 tons of, I believe it's 5 tons of hydrogen and more than 50 tons of ammonia, you move up to a new level of safety risk within the ports. And actually those volumes are quite insignificant when we're talking about a ship and the fuel tanks on a ship. So it is a key part, but I think part of it, and I think it comes into one of the other questions as well, is there are challenges there from a technology side, but hopefully that technology will be matured and then it can be transferred to various countries. So it can be matured on these green corridors, matured on the various pilot projects which are happening at the moment, so that we're not the small developing countries not being used as a test bed for the technology. I think the challenge is going to be in training. And again, this is going to be anywhere because we're having new fuels not used a lot, and there will be part of the training which will be required. But if we flip over to the opportunities, when we've looked at the cost of fuels, the cost is very much derived from the renewable electricity price. And renewable electricity, the cheapest way to produce renewable electricity is through solar. So there's the opportunity here for small, rather than importing a hydrogen or ammonia, it could potentially also be produced locally on site. Now, it will be smaller volumes unless you have very large wind farms and solar arrays everywhere. But if we're talking about small domestic voyages for vessels and ports that are integrated into each other with the shipping industries as well, supplying these routes, it may actually produce, one, an opportunity to produce a fuel through renewable electricity locally, and therefore you're not, one, importing and paying for fuel, and you're potentially becoming a fuel exporter yourself. So there's that sort of sustainability aspect in it as well, and the opportunities there to be looked at.
Right. Thank you for that answer, Charles. And I hope Adrian, well, we have another question from him, which we will get to later. Maybe we can just get another question for Charles, and then I'll move to Juan. And this is from Nadine, a question on to what extent do you think ports will also enter synthetic fuel production?
Yeah, that's no, so it's a good question. There's some pilots happening, and sort of what I was just discussing is we have there is the opportunity there to produce fuels locally at the ports, and it needs to be integrated, not just for the shipping industry, but actually ports are that connection between sea and the land-based, but are often at a safe place to store fuels. So it needs to be linked into the wider energy context of not just shipping, but of the island's energy usage as well. Now, when we look at energy usage, and we're moving to a green economy and a zero carbon fuel, your first port of call is to use the electrons, because we're taking renewable electricity and creating hydrogen through electrolysis for a fuel for the ship. Actually, the first step would be electrification. It's a lot more energy efficient to store the power that way. So hopefully that would be used in most cases. In terms of shipping, we can use batteries as well. However, the energy density of batteries will be very large. So actually, you'll be taking up a lot of cargo space. It may be applicable in some cases though. So I think ports can play a big part there. They could produce their own fuels, and there is a case in Portsmouth ports in UK, which is trialing an electrolyzer within the port to produce hydrogen, and that hydrogen will be used for some small vessels operating in the port, but also will feed into the grid, into the gas grid as well, and blend in hydrogen with gas, and use the trucks and everything operating around the port on hydrogen. So there's a lot of opportunities there, and it's capturing these learning points and examples from other places and trying to bring them in.
Great. Thank you, Charles. This is all very, very exciting, actually. So there is a lot of possibilities out there, and it looks like we can figure things out. So if we can move the conversation a bit, well, this is kind of more related to the greenhouse gas emissions and the climate mitigation part. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about the climate adaptation. And so I'd like to ask Juan. You had talked about you had mentioned the readiness of the national governments in the Pacific Island states for, to be able to, they're willing to accept new technology, but obviously it's not as easy. I mean, it's not enough to just have the willingness. Of course, that's very important, but together with that, there are many other hurdles and challenges to overcome. whether it comes to improving the port infrastructure itself, or other technology required for the shipping industry as a whole. So maybe Juan, you could talk to us a little bit about these challenges and what else needs to be done in order to really accelerate the adoption of new technology in the Pacific Islands.
Yeah, thanks, Karma. Well, it's a very difficult question. I think it's all. I said that before. It's all about reliability. I think so, no? Because yeah, they're willing to adopt new technology, like any person in the world. No, you're always willing to keep up to the latest innovation, to the latest technology. No, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure that this is reliable and this is going to be sustainable, no, in the future, no, and it's also about finding the balance, no, between responding to the immediate needs and of building or rebuilding essential infrastructure, and also going one step ahead, no, and say, well, maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe we focus on bringing something different, no? Or maybe, this is also about policy, no? Maybe the role of some of the partners should be promoting, this shift, no, to newer technology and more advanced technology. So it's a very difficult question, because you have events and then you have immediate needs. And it's very difficult to say, no, we cannot do that. We will focus only on this thing, on this project or in that project. It's very difficult to do that when you can see that there is something happening that needs to be addressed, no? So yeah, finding that balance is very complicated. And then Charles also said something about the training of the people, no, in being able to use the new technology. It's also very challenging. We see that in many in the region, no? For example, the maintenance of the ships, no? Some of them, they require, maintaining a ship is not something simple, no? And if you want to maintain the classification of your ship, no, like if you want to go to Lloyd Register or something like that, you say, I want to. The standards are very high, no, and they should comply with them, no, because at the end this is about safety, no, about the safety of the people, no. So when it is so difficult to address what we have at the moment on our plate, then the challenge is, how do we move forward, no? How do we resolve this, or maybe we find the solution or the project or the component that in a way brings innovation and at the same time responds to these issues or challenges in terms of training, in terms of basic infrastructure, no? Especially in a region like the Pacific, no? I think ADB's work also covers other regions, but the region of the Pacific is very peculiar, no? It has very unique characteristics, no? So it's finding the balance is the challenge, no? I think so.
Thank you, Juan. I know it's a difficult question, and it kind of related to what you already said, actually, about these competing priorities. And there is a question from Adrian. Thank you for these great questions, Adrian Summons. So it's similar, and it's not easy either, Juan, but maybe you can give it a go. So Adrian's question is your view on green port developments for the Pacific Islands. What would you consider are the highest priority in the Pacific ports? Greenhouse gas emissions, lowering carbon footprint, light spill, noise and vibration, dust, stormwater runoff, contamination. So there are a lot of environmental and climate change issues. It's a difficult question, but maybe if you could think about like those specific things that he mentioned, what do you think is the highest priority?
Well, it's a very difficult question, no? Because if you pick one, then no, sometimes we say, then the other one is not important. Well, all of them are very important, no? And it's very difficult to say this is more important than the other, no? But sometimes it also relates to where the port is located, no? In some cases, if the port is near the city center, or if it is in a region that is in a location that is closer to where the people live, then noise and vibration and dust is very important. If it is in a protected area, well, the truth is that the waters in the Pacific are so pristine that you can see corals almost in any corner of any island, no? So that is the reality, no? That most of the, depends on the project, depends on the location, but the greenhouse emissions is also very important, no? But the fleet, especially the domestic fleet of these countries, is quite small, no? When compared to the international fleet. I was looking at the map before of the ships between Hong Kong and Singapore, no? I mean, this is the busiest corridor in the world, no? Well, the Pacific doesn't look like that, no? I mean, especially the domestic connectivity, no, in between the countries, no? But anyway, that's something that has to be done as well, no? They also deserve, and the technology has to arrive to everybody, no? So, yeah, I think it's a case by case, available funding, and trying to find the best balance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. And actually, I think we really have to consider the local context. Like you mentioned, it depends on the location of the port. If it is, the port is located near a very important biodiversity area, then perhaps that would be the top priority. If it is located next to some sensitive receptors on land, then perhaps noise and vibration is a bigger priority. So it's really context specific. But thank you for answering the question. And so if I can move back to Charles now, and this is yet another question from Adrian, very interesting. Given the increased capex of zero carbon ships, new zero carbon ships, do you think this will stimulate further global mergers and acquisitions of shipping companies and ship owners? Charles?
No, thank you. It's a good question again. And but just before I answer that, I'll just flip on to what Juan was just talking about and that question as well, and how we see the similar in shipping as well. It's not just about decarbonization of shipping. There's other aspects, recycling of shipping with noise and vibration as well, carbon footprint, building the ships. They're all aspects to be taken into account. And what we're sort of also looking at is, whilst our focus, or my focus at the moment, is the decarbonization of shipping and getting to that zero by 2050, and meeting the metrics along the way. But it's actually, what can this be the catalyst for? Because we're going to have a major change in the way ships are designed and operated. So how does this lead to things? What are the catalysts there? Larger automation to increase seafarer well-being and safety. But also, if we're going to redesign a ship, because they've always just evolved a little bit, but now we can have a big step change. So how can we redesign a ship to be more recyclable at the end? And these are all things which can be an offshoot. So whilst we've got, which is the highest priority, I think one part is, how can we use this energy transition to address some of those priorities so that we're resilient from the beginning? So that's just sort of answering that question from a shipping part as well as a port part. But in terms of the CapEx question, it's a very interesting question, and it's something which is in the paper as well, and something we've looked at. Is at the moment, when a ship owner is ordering a ship, the cost of the ship is a very high consideration when we look at the total life operating cost of the vessel or the fleet. Now, that's partly driven by, it's a high capex at the beginning, but when we look at the percentages, fuel is relatively cheap today. And when you suddenly move to an era where fuel is going to be 2 to 4 times more expensive, is that percentage of the capex is less relevant than it was before. And the other part, when we look at the capex of the vessels, is certainly so far, particularly for ammonia and methanol fueled ships, and work is being done on hydrogen to bring down the technology costs. As those costs come down, is actually the cost of that ship could be less or equal to building a LNG fueled ship today. So it's not so much about the capex, it's going to be about total life cycle. And this is why we need those resilient plans as well, ship owners to understand that even an ammonia fueled ship may have the same capex or slightly higher capex than an HFO ship. That's not the consideration they need to be thinking about. It's going to be the cost of the fuel and their business resilience moving forwards. But will we see global mergers? I think we will see some some mergers. But what we would hope is to see the large industry players to be the early adopters, the small industry players to be able to take some of those learnings and not take the risk of being an early adopter, but some of them will, and there will be winners and unfortunately losers in the energy transition of shipping companies who have made the right call, and we may find new shipping companies coming to the forefront as well. So yeah, in terms of the mergers, that's very difficult. But in terms of the CapEx, and it's very similar to what you're talking about, port development and road infrastructure, Karma, that actually, yeah, it's not about just the cost of the road or the cost of the port, it's about the upkeep of that over time. And in the case of shipping, it's going to be about the cost of paying for that fuel over time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Charles. And maybe we can take just one last question since we are approaching the end of the hour. And we have a good question from Russell Stevens for Juan on what you think about applying a regional approach to greening ports, whether that is beneficial with respect to knowledge and resource sharing, generation of guidance documents, development of additional standards, and environmental monitoring and sharing the findings. So using a regional approach, what do you think?
Well, yeah, of course, no. There's nothing in the Pacific that is not regional, no. I mean, it's like there's countries are so small, so remote, so the economies depend on each other so much. There is nothing in the region that is in the Pacific that is not regional. And the greening of the ports and the knowledge sharing, of course, no. And it's not about creating competition, no. But we arrange sometimes ADB forums between the different port authorities or the different stakeholders. Everybody knows what is happening. There are also regional arrangements, no, like the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership. So everybody is aware of what the neighbor is doing, no? So that, in a way, it's a good thing, no, for them, no, to think, well, if they're doing this, I need to do a bit better. You need to improve, no, and that's life, no. That's how things are in life, no, and then sharing what they are doing, aspirational standards and regional environmental monitoring. We cannot do something that is not that, no, because that's the way the region is structured, no. It's not like a big economy with a big country that can be considered the country itself as a region, no. Here we have like a 15, 20, 25, depends how you count the different countries, no. But of course, anything we do has to consider a regional approach, no. Otherwise, these isolated solutions will not succeed, no, I think.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think it totally makes sense using a regional approach, particularly in the Pacific Islands. Thank you very much, Juan. And thank you so much, Charles, for this great presentations and discussion. I'm not very familiar with the port industry, though I have worked as an environmental specialist on a few port projects. So this has been completely enlightening for me. Thank you very much. So just to highlight a few key takeaways, which I understood at least, and I hope that's correct, is this ambitious goal of the maritime and shipping industry to achieve, initially it was 50% of greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050, but now moving to zero by 2050. So the target is getting more ambitious, and there is the plan for green corridors to establish green corridors by 2025, and to have zero carbon fuel by 2030. So these are all ambitious targets. However, there has also been good progress made, particularly with identifying new kind of low carbon fuels such as methanol, ammonia, and hydrogen. And I think the key issue seems to be the investment. The technology is already there, has been developed. It's more a matter of getting the investors interested in it and figuring out the safety features. And also, of course, the practicalities of making sure the new fuel fits with the ships, new kind of ships because even the ships will have to be redesigned to accommodate these new fuels. So, but it's all a very inspiring and encouraging story, and it's great to know about this progress in the shipping industry. And from Huan, what I took away was that in the Pacific Islands, actually, the infrastructure needs are actually quite basic. But having said that, they have a lot of competing challenges, especially because of the nature of it being island states, and they are being subjected to a lot of climate change impact events and disaster risk. And of course, there is the decarbonization, reducing greenhouse gas emissions priority as well. And there are a lot of competing priorities. So it's a matter of balancing what should be, important and really making it fit with the local context of each island country. So yes, so it's really trying to meet those challenges and trying to be specific. But the good thing is at least the governments are open and willing to integrate new technology in their countries. So with that, and I hope I got the key messages correctly. Thank you so much to the audience. Thank you for the great questions. Especially Adrian Salmons, a lot of great questions. Thank you very much. And I would like to inform our audience that we have 2 follow-up events on this topic. There is another event that is being organized by ADB, which is coming up. It's the RCI, the Regional Connectivity and Integration Innovation Seminar on Green Ports, which will be held in late February. So please stay tuned for that. And then we will also have our flagship event, which is the Transport Forum, which will take place in April this year. And of the many sessions in the forum, there will be a session on net zero transportation. So please also stay tuned for this upcoming event. And lastly, thank you very much for attending this spotlight session. And I hope our audience were also able to find time to attend the other exciting sessions in this Healthy Ocean Forum. And I would like to invite you to please attend the closing plenary, which is happening at 4:30, so in about half an hour from now. Please do join the forum, and that's where we will hear the recap of all the events that took place over the 3 days. And yeah, it's been great participating in this particular session. I personally learned a lot, and I hope our audience also got some information and learned some new information from this session. So with that, I close the session. Thank you very much.